What is ink made out of? I'm going to speak specifically historically in the ancient Near East and in Europe. So some of the earliest examples of ink that we have are ink cakes, and so this is like a shell watercolor, which is based very similarly on the ink cakes that we see in ancient Egypt and other parts of the ancient Middle East, where you would have a cake of binder and lampblack that would be mixed together, lampblack being soot that is collected off of oil lamps. And you would collect that soot, you would mix that with a binder of some kind. Typically it was a water-soluble gum, either gum acacia, also known as gum arabic, or it could be gum from a stone fruit. So stone fruit trees also produce a water-soluble gum that works very well for producing a binder for ink. And so you would use that to write either on papyrus or on some of the early forms of parchment or birch bark or something like that, painting on walls in stone. After those ink cakes, we start to see more completely liquid and more stored suspensions of lampblack and gum arabic. In China, which is not really what we're talking about, you get a lot of hide glues and other things, resins and things that are used to bind that into ink sticks, and then those are ground on a stone and used as that. We start to see smaller amounts being made by scribes. There's some evidence of it. There's some written descriptions in a more liquid form, and because we start to see ink wells and not just ink cakes being used. And so those ink wells start to show up with a carbon-based ink. There's then a transitional period, and this transitional period, we see both pure lampblack ink being used in certain regions, and then we see a lampblack hybridized with iron gall starting to be used. So you both get carbon and iron gall being used in certain regions and certain times, particularly in the ancient Near East and Italy and places like that. After this transitional period where we see both iron gall ink mixed with a carbon black ink kind of being used regularly, there's a lot of hypotheses as to why this happened. Some maybe it was an accidental discovery or natural discovery, but there's lots of evidence of recipes for darkening leather and things with iron salts mixed with the tannins that were already being used to tan that leather. And so the knowledge of this coloration was known in different trades, maybe not in the scribal trade. You also have to remember that a lot of writing held a lot of power. There's a lot of kind of mysticism behind what goes into your recipes, as to whether that's for different reasons you would add different things. And there's some evidence of that in kind of recipe analysis, kind of the elemental analysis of different recipes from different periods and different regions and things. We then transition away from this hybrid ink where we see both, which actually we see in insular work and even into the 700s in England. We transition into the predominant ink that gets used. So we then switch to a pure iron gall ink. So again, insular work showed both carbon and iron gall mixed with that. There were a number of transitional things, but by the time we get primarily to the 7th, 8th century, and mostly starts to transition in the 5th century as well, we see mostly pure iron gall being used because they realized it worked fine. So carbon ink, keeping carbon with the iron gall gives you a blacker black when you first write, but that iron gall oxidizes to a dark black over time if you have enough of the iron and the gall in there. Also, there's fermentation processes that allow it to get blacker and bluer black, and it gives you something that's not going to scrape off the page and flake off the page. It binds more permanently with parchment. With that hide, the tannin in that actually gives it a much better adherence and actually chemically bonds to that complex. Can bind to the skin, and so you get a more permanent ink that generally lasts longer. And when I say that iron gall ink lasts longer than carbon-based ink, I mean in usage. You have to remember books were meant to be read, meant to be handled, meant to have the pages turned. And so carbon-based ink rubs off with abrasion. As you rub those pages against one another, you will lose carbon-based ink because it just sits on the surface and doesn't really soak in and bind permanently to that page, whereas iron gall does. Now, yes, in a pure storage condition, carbon-based ink will last infinitely longer than iron gall because iron gall is susceptible to oxidative attack, to more moisture, whereas carbon itself, lampblack, is highly resistant to that, is very close to the most stable allotrope of carbon, and so it's going to last, but the binder will degrade and all of those other things will happen as well, and it will flake off and it will become abradable, and so iron gall still tends to win even in long-term storage if there's any handling. So iron gall ink, if you include the hybrid systems, gets used from about the 1st and 2nd century AD all the way until we get to the 19th century, the 1800s, and then it transitions into a fountain pen ink or blue-black inks that were used in schools with dip pens, even into the 20th century as well. So iron gall has a very large body where it is the primary ink being used in some form or another. I would argue because it works and it lasts, and the materials to produce it are really not that hard to come by if you have trade or plants or iron of any kind. So the iron gall ink that I use in my work is one of the inks that I make. This is one of the 1-ounce bottles. It is based on recipes from the 11th century all the way through recipes in the 16th century, and then a bunch of chemistry behind it, so things looking at ink degradation and what makes the best inks that we have that last a long time, the recipes that we have, and then kind of the chemical analysis of the ones that tend to burn through paper, have copper contamination, so eliminating that, and then getting the ratios of tannin and iron in the right ratios so that they have the best chance of behaving long term and having good long term stability. And so that is the ink that I use.